Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the BuzzStream Podcast. I'm your host, Vince Nero, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Dominic Ponsford, the editor-in-chief at the Press Gazette. Dominic's been in the game for a really long time. Started as a journalist and back in the 90s. He was the editor at the Press Gazette for a bit, took a brief detour to work with Global Data before joining back in 2020 as the editor-in-chief, where he is today. And today we're really going to be talking all about the state of journalism, the impact of AI. As you may or may not know, the Press Gazette does fantastic work reporting on this type of thing. So I thought, who better to bring in to talk about all this stuff than Dominic? So before we get into that, I just want to remind people to like, subscribe, give a thumbs up, share this stuff with your friends and colleagues. That goes a real long way to helping me keep this thing going. And secondly, just a reminder to check out List IQ if you haven't. It's our Chrome extension. It's an AI-powered media list builder that can help you build lists right from Google News. And it pulls a lot of that information like email addresses, bios, author tags, activity check, all that stuff that takes a real long time to manually dig into. It'll pull it in just seconds. So check it out, sign up, get some free credits. And with that out of the way, let's get going. Dominic, how you doing? Thanks so much for joining. I'm really excited to speak with you today.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Vince.
I guess first thing I want to start with is you've been in this business for a long time. Is any of the stuff that we're seeing kind of new to the point that you're worried about the future of this business, or have we kind of been through crises like this in the past?
Well, I think so. I've been editor of Press Gazette for 20 plus years. I've been involved in it for 20 plus years. So yeah, I mean, really since 2008, things have been fairly bumpy. I think probably apart from maybe 2022 was pretty good year as we bounced back from the pandemic. Everything felt pretty buoyant. It felt like we were in the sort of sunlit uplands of recovery. But apart from that, it's always felt pretty bumpy. So 2008, we had the financial crash, all the classified advertising went. And then since then, there's been waves of things, smartphones, broadband, social media, etc. So it's all been disrupted. But yeah, I think probably I'm starting to think just over the last few months that maybe we're entering a sort of new era, really.
And is it all AI based, you think?
Yeah, it's a new era in the sense that it's just so convenient, isn't it? It's a good user experience, isn't it? Chat GPT and the other ones, they offer a good user experience. So, it's easier, isn't it? If I had to fix something that's gone wrong with my car, say, or solve some niche problem, I'd have to read a bunch of articles, watch some YouTube videos, engage with lots of content. Now I can just ask ChatGPT, it's done all that. It seems to be able to get me the information I need. I think there's for lots of types of information, it's a much better user experience. And I think it's just in a new era where publishers need to figure out a completely different model, that's not based around the old bargain of someone sending us clicks. It's we're sending someone information and they're making money out of that and they need to pay us for that.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point. I dig into this a little bit. I think this idea of, the bargain, as you said, with Google, right? Do you think publishers have a chance against AI, or do they all need to should they all be submitting and signing deals?
Well, I think individually you can see why people will sign the deals, and maybe individually it's a sensible thing to do in the short term. But I do think collectively these individual deals don't do the industry any good in the long term. Yeah, I mean, do we have a chance? Yeah, of course we do. I mean, I think I've always thought that any of these platforms would be very much less interesting places to spend time without professionally produced content on them. Google and Facebook, certainly any of the LLMs, without verified publisher content, they would be very much less interesting. So they do whatever they say. I think they do depend on publishers for a kind of spine of kind of verified facts about what's happening day to day in the world. So I think that's not going to change. That's essential. We're still quite a long way from figuring out how translates into something that's sustainable like for everyone, for the publishers and for the platforms as well, because I think they do have a bit of a vested interest in publishers surviving. I'm sure it's not something that keeps them awake at night, but I think I think it is something that they should be bothered about, even if they're not.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point there too. They do rely on, like you said, these publishers and news to serve the content that these people want. So it is a little bit to me of like biting the hand that feeds them, right? I have a hard time believing that Google is doing what they need to do to actually help these publishers survive. But I'm curious what you feel.
Well, I mean, Google, I do a lot on like Google's revenue in the UK and its share of the market, the publishing market. Google and Meta and TikTok probably, they basically are the media now in the UK. That's the media in terms of online media and the market, and the publishers are like just a tiny part now. In terms of advertising revenue, there may be a couple of % of total advertising revenue compared to maybe 40% when I started. So, is that Google's fault? Would someone else have done it? It wasn't them. I don't know. I mean, they've got the money now. They've got the revenue that used to pay for thousands and thousands of journalists. So if thousands of journalists don't have jobs anymore because that money goes to Google, small and medium advertisers. I mean, they distribute probably more money than you realise in the UK via these deals, like the News Showcase deals that they did a few years ago, which are sort of notionally payments to publishers for content to appear in something called News Showcase, which I don't think anyone's ever looked at. I don't think people are going to News Showcase every day to check out their news. It's it's basically it's a confected product which serves the purpose of allowing Google to give publishers some money to so that publishers don't sue them and kick the whole kind of regulation piece a little bit further down the road. But, it's nothing compared to the revenue they take out of the market, of the ad market.
Yeah. I mean, you talked a little bit about, I know the Future Media Trends event that you had. I found it interesting, this idea of like the different ways that these newsrooms are adopting AI, getting back to this idea of like, do you submit or do you, give in? I know this isn't exactly Google leading these things, but it sounds like there are a lot of publishers who are starting to utilize AI outside of like the partnership stuff. Do you think that at this point there is a way forward with, newsrooms using AI in a proper way, let's say, without, sacrificing journalistic integrity and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone's using AI pretty much. We did some research on this. We got about 200 responses from our readers asking them how they use AI. In terms of using it to actually, create finished articles, a very small percentage of people admit to doing that. 4% of people said they're actually doing that. So, the sort of things people are using it for, research, headline ideas. Obviously, most people use it to transcribe interviews. A lot of people are using it for things like editing and visualization. There's a lot going on, and people use it for. I mean, lots of people have used it to streamline their editorial processes a bit. So, to sort of automate things a bit. Yeah. So it's all good stuff. I don't think there's anything game changing that publishers are doing in terms of the way they use AI. The game changing thing will be when that they're working on it with the group called the Spur Coalition. A lot of UK publishers are involved in that. But I think the thing that will potentially be game changing is when they figure out a way to sort of collectively sort of control access for bots and license access and track usage and try and figure out a kind of payments protocol for them getting paid, which I think is doable. But I guess the thing they've got to do, which is the hard thing, is they all need to collectively prepare to say, yeah, we'll just switch off the taps then if you don't engage with us. Which is that's the hard thing to do, isn't it? Because that's the kind of, if that's possible, I think it may be possible. I think it's very, very hard, isn't it, to block all bots without unintended consequences of blocking.
Yeah. And so there's kind of a lot here. And one thing I'm realizing that I should have you help clarify a little bit is the kind of differences here we're facing with the UK versus the US in terms of legally how I feel like there's kind of different protections that websites have in the UK and EU versus the US. Can you kind of lay out a little bit of the differences there? Because there seems to be more litigation, I should say, in the UK that is coming out in the positive side for publishers, at least from what I'm seeing. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Dominic, but could you kind of lay out for listeners, especially the US ones, kind of the differences there that what they're facing?
Well, I think it's a fairly similar landscape in the sense that copyright is at the heart of it all, and that's untested ground, and I think that's still untested in the US as well, although there's a lot of claims going on over what we can copyright when it comes to news and facts and content. I think as in the EU, in the UK, and the US, there's big exemptions, aren't there, for tech companies? The different laws, but they amount to the same thing, which is they're like the phone company providing the telephone calls or whatever, or the innocent dissemination or whatever you call it, but basically the idea that they're not, they're a sort of utility, so they're not liable for things, which, you all day about that, but, I think we disagree. Once you start writing your own AI answers, I'd say you've jumped, haven't you? You've gone from being someone who, transmit things to someone who creates things, and that's by the by. The one interesting thing that's going on in the UK at the moment, which hasn't got a lot of coverage, but we've covered it a bit, is there's a small group of independent publishers are trying to use contract law to go after the tech giants, which I'm sure that's something you could do in the US as well, because contract law is as old as it goes back to the Roman Empire. It's the basis of all law. But basically, they've changed their terms and conditions on their websites to say, by entering this website, tick here, the terms and conditions state that you can't scrape and reuse this content. If you scrape and reuse this content, we'll charge you £500 or whatever, $800 per article. So there's a group of independent publishers now in the UK are just starting to go through small local courts now, small claims courts, and they just said, we're not going to get into copyright. We're just saying, you've used this article without permission. Here's the contract. You've broken the contract. Pay me £500 for this article, and that's something that can be settled by a local judge in a £50 or $80 hearing. So that's going to be interesting, because that's like a new front in it. But that could potentially, be very interesting, because it presents quite a challenge if you're a multi-billion-dollar tech company and you're suddenly getting thousands of small claims court claims. Just the same way as people send claims to publishers all the time over photographs and things they've used without consent. It'd just be the same process.
Yeah. I don't think people realize how much litigation goes on behind the scenes and a lot of that stuff. I mean, there's websites, services that will do exactly what you're saying, down where it's like people will, you can scan the web for uses of your photography, for instance, and one click and you can set a claim, out to remove it or get paid. So that's interesting. Another thing I've heard a lot is, at least in the US here, I'm curious if this is happening in your neck of the woods too, of like publishers, the union, especially the ones part of the union are essentially staging like either walkouts or putting up a fight for when a publisher, their employer, will employ some type of AI, rewrite summary or something on their articles. That's something that they're butting heads against their employers about, because sometimes they get them wrong. And I even think that maybe something you guys have reported on, but is that something, staging strikes and stuff like this clash between the actual journalists and the sites that they work at? Is that something that happens often still?
There's not been much of that in the UK that I know about. I think the thing which freelance journalists in the UK get annoyed about, which we still haven't got to the bottom of, is the fact that their work is being licensed to AI companies without any permission being sought. I mean, the same for staffers, but they've got less rights. But freelancers have got more rights to the copyright in their work in the UK. They basically own the copyright in their work. So I know people are definitely annoyed about that, because you say their work gets licensed, by the publisher. The publisher's getting money from that, and then the AI company kind of sort of mutates it into something that's not always accurate. So, it doesn't necessarily reflect that well on the author, and the author's not got any money for it either. So, yeah, that's kind of untested ground. I think in Germany, certainly in some parts of Europe, there are deals where the publishers have done licensing deals. And I think they've actually, given the journalists some extra money, to compensate them for that, which sounds like a good idea.
Yeah. I mean, let's shift over to the more the journalist side of things too, because obviously there's also this ongoing story of journalists being let go, layoffs. It's funny. I speak to some kind of local journalists here, people that work at local news sites and news networks in the U.S. And some of them will say, "Oh yeah, we haven't been impacted. We don't have layoffs here." Then you'll see articles, come in the Press Gazette, for instance, these bigger media sites laying off, thousands, hundreds of employees at a time. It's really hard to track this sort of thing. I've been digging into like BLS information, census information, and the UK equivalents to understand things like journalist jobs and PR jobs, all that kind of stuff. It's kind of a mess the way that all that is written. But I I mean, do you agree? Is the overall kind of message that employment is shrinking, journalists shrinking across the globe? Is this a UK centric thing? Just curious where you stand with this.
I mean, in terms of what we can track, like you say, it's really hard to track. I mean, even if you look at employment data, when you get down to, because journalism is quite a small profession, the sample sizes become very small. So it's hard to, you can't really extrapolate how people answer those sort of surveys. If you were to take, for instance, the three biggest local newspaper publishers in the UK, who together control like more than half the market, so they're a decent proxy for what's going on. We think they employ about 25% or 20% of the journalists that they did in 2007. So basically on the eve of we always take that as our starting point, because if you believe it or not, the mid-2000s was actually the high watermark for print profitability. So that was probably the most profitable time for print newspapers, even though circulation was already going down then. They still had a massive advertising market. Yeah, so looking at those big publishers, they're much smaller than they were now. Than they were then. But it's quite patchy, because then you look at someone like the Financial Times or the Times of London. They've actually got a really successful subscription products now. So they're actually more profitable now than they were in the mid-2000s. So they've got rid of unprofitable print circulation and replaced it with profitable digital circulation. So it's patchy. And then obviously there's a whole new world of different, news business out there, from, one person Substacks to, different sorts of data products that are out there, So it's difficult to say, but in terms of like what most people really care about, which is local journalism, or what I care about anyway, in terms of local journalism, that is, there's definitely, I would say, probably about a quarter the size now than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah, we'll be curious to see kind of how this all shakes out as we get into kind of the more like agentic world, where websites potentially carry less value and people are just interacting with agents to gather their news and whatnot. But you did mention a few interesting things when it comes to the publishers, and it's something I'd love to dig into a little bit of this idea of like what they are doing to fight these declines in revenue and now declines in traffic due to AI. But the subscription model seems to be one, right? Like you have to kind of pay to read. What are some other, you've written about this a lot, and I'm going to share a bunch of these articles in the show notes, but in the Press Gazette of these different publishers, what are some of them doing to kind of fight the decline in traffic and kind of either raise the quality of their work so that people will subscribe, or that they're reaching audience in different platforms, as you kind of mentioned? What are some of the things that they're doing to fight AI?
Yeah, well, there's a lot going on. And probably some of it's quite positive in a way, because the Google search era didn't always encourage, good journalism. There are a lot of people earning money just, you know, writing, I don't know, rewriting the trending stories of the day, like 100 different versions of whatever Kim Kardashian had been up to that day. It didn't necessarily add to the sum total of human knowledge or, push us forward anywhere in terms of, human civilization. So I feel like there's a general trend away from that towards quality, and quality means things that can't be replicated by LLMs. So that's like longer, more discursive investigations that provide a lot of analysis and color, and just obviously the LLM and that is only ever going to give you an aggregation of what's going on. So something that takes a lot more explanation. There's a lot more comment, personality, leaning into newsletters in a big way. It's a direct relationship with the reader, personality led, and providing just something that you're not going to get anywhere else. More human, really. Everyone's doing a lot more on social media, like social first video, creator led video. I mean, I worry that that's maybe just going to just be tomorrow's problem, because you're still renting an audience, really, aren't you? Or borrowing an audience from these platforms who might be friendly at the moment, but they're not going to be friendly forever. But that's people are doing well with that. It doesn't always foster the best kind of in terms of journalism, because that the economy of that is all about ad placements, isn't it, and brand partnerships. So McDonald's paying a journalist to write about standards in the meat industry is not going to, that's not going to encourage a lot of investigative journalism, but that is, that's something that they do, and something I've seen on mainstream publications. So, that's what's going on. And actually, to give Google credit, YouTube is at the moment does seem to be a fruitful place to launch, new sort of journalism products. The algorithm helps people grow very quickly. And there's a newspaper in the UK, Daily Express, which is probably one of the newspapers you'd say is the most likely to kind of, for its print edition, to probably not be around that much longer. It's kind of quite an old-fashioned sort of newspaper that writes a lot about kind of new cures for diabetes and sort of stuff like that. But they've launched a YouTube show, which I think now is the most popular YouTube show brought out by a UK newspaper, and they launched it from nothing to being really popular in the space of a year. Yeah, YouTube's a good place to build an audience, and publishers are doing quite well with that. Events, obviously, maybe not obviously, but if anyone who's in any sort of specialist or B2B market is doing really well with events. Press Gazette's no different. We do really well with events because, it's actually it's very hard to convene the right people in one place. And if you've got that daily or weekly relationship with them, as a publisher, you can definitely do that. Yeah. So there's a few different ways that publishers are certainly keeping their audience, and probably to a certain lesser extent, keeping on to revenue. And of course, rules are growing in a big way in the UK from, not big, almost everyone has a paywall now. Almost every major publisher has a paywall now.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're definitely seeing that a lot in the US too, especially some of these more specialized, like the Verge or I forget if CNET has one, like those types of news publication, like tech, that's that sort of thing. I'm curious, as we're talking here, you've said this kind of a couple times, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the news as, the news's role, the news publications' role as you see it. You've kind of alluded to this idea of like news publications as entertainment versus news publications as, pushing the world into a better place, or they have these goals or these standards, editorial standards that are going to kind of do good. I do think there's this ongoing clash as you talk about it. I'm thinking, of this, you need to entertain to keep viewers, right? So like people are going to be more apt, or publishers are going to be more apt to try different things. And I'll give you one example before I start, before you answer. This morning, I saw the Wall Street Journal had like a interactive quiz on their site. And it's like the first time I've ever seen something like that. It felt very kind of BuzzFeedy, and it was like a quiz about attire, business attire, what you should wear to work. And on the one hand, it's interesting, it's entertaining, but to your point, is it moving the world along to a better place? It's just kind of curious your thoughts and take on this.
Well, there's always been a role for kind of the frothier end of journalism, the stuff that kind of adds to the gaiety of the nation, as it were. Yeah, so I think sometimes what publishers say is that they do that sort of stuff, the kind of lighter stuff, to kind of cross-subsidize the more serious stuff. Maybe that's maybe there's an element of that. I mean, I think you can do everything kind of well, really. I mean, everything you do should be, providing some revelation. I think, from the world of celebrity, why not investigate that a little bit? And, why should those sort of incredibly well-paid people just be allowed to sort of effectively write their own press release, and then everyone just repeat it, which is what I think what they want to happen, isn't it? So yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the journalists and the way we look at ourselves and the way the industry thinks about itself, I think there's still a really strong kind of mission in the industry. I think most people become journalists because they they want to be like Clark Kent. They want to kind of take on the bad guys and change the world a bit and have some fun doing it. And it's certainly, with publishers, that's what they talk about. That's what they're most happiest talking about in terms of their achievements, is when they've really kind of moved the dial a bit and kind of stood up to someone and got a story across. And to be fair, and we look at it with Press Gazette, and I'm sure publishers themselves see it as well. There's never anything more compelling than a publisher presenting, a series of true facts which are incredibly uncomfortable for someone to read, but they've published and they can prove they're right, and they keep putting them out there. And then there's a fascination to that, isn't there? When the Wall Street Journal published that creepy birthday card that Donald Trump sent to Epstein with a kind of, it was like a little poem or whatever it was, and a doodle of a woman's private parts, and you just read that and you think, oh my God, wow. And they spent months and months standing that story up, and then they published it, and now they're getting, I can't remember if they settled. I think they might have settled that, but certainly got sued for like tens of millions over it. And that's the sort of thing that they're kind of really proud to kind of talk about more necessarily than the kind of P&L.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the stuff that the Press Gazette has recently done. That's kind of, I feel like it's blown up and exposing the kind of fake experts out in the world, and, the subsequent kind of copyright, claims that are taking down the posts on the Press Gazette. Can you fill people in who are unaware of this?
Well, so it all began about a year or so ago when a journalist we work with called Rob Waugh. He's a freelancer, so he uses these things called journalist request services, which are sort of like kind of online marketplaces that will broker, journalists ask questions, and then PR people send them a bunch of answers, and then it's just a quick and easy way for a freelance journalist to write a feature and get a bunch of quotes in. And he uses those, and he basically found that there was some people on there who were answering these questions almost instantly on like a vast range of subjects, quicker than seemed humanly possible. So the first thing we thought, well, they're using AI to draft these answers. But then when we dug into it, we found that actually these widely quoted people weren't just using AI. They themselves were a creation of AI, so they didn't exist. And so the first one we looked into was a woman called Barbara Santini, who's an Oxford-educated psychologist who's an expert on relationship matters, and she's probably the most widely quoted psychotherapist in the UK in terms of media mentions. And we we found out that basically the only existence of her online in terms of biographies and citations and stuff was on a sex toys website. Where she's also their kind of resident kind of psychotherapist. So we thought it's a bit weird that they've got sex toys website that's got a psychotherapist. But anyway, after going around the houses with this and me actually I even had a WhatsApp exchange with Barbara, if that's who she is. We basically said, well, look, we don't think she exists. We don't think she's real. All these stories are fake. And that's hundreds and hundreds of stories in most of the mainstream publications in the UK. So, suffice to say, year on, Barbara has never given a quote to anyone else since then. And she's not sued me. So she's not demanded £1 million, for me saying she doesn't exist. So, since then, we found dozens of examples of this, and we've got a dossier of more than 1,000 articles, published articles. So, there's a lot of AI-generated fakery going on. To cut a long story short, basically the people at the heart of it are SEO professionals who basically, or people on the fringe of SEO. I think even like real SEO people don't really like the idea of these people being described as SEO. But basically, they see expert brand mentions and links in reputable websites as a solution to a technical challenge, which are the technical challenges for them is increasing the ranking of their websites and increasing clicks. And they often represent the sort of websites that find it hard to get links because they're kind of on the fringes of things, so they do sex toys or they're casinos or there's something. Yeah. And so there's an industry of people who are spewing out fake AI generated content packaged up to journalists, and, journalists were publishing it to kind of feed need for SEO clicks. And they've kind of no one complained about it really until we started digging into it, and the publishers became very embarrassed when they actually realised what was going on.
Yeah, and then you guys published a few stories about this, and actually they were taken down by Google, right?
Yeah, so that's a whole nother thing, isn't it? This Digital Millennium Copyright Act in the US, which means that anyone can complain about anything online and claim it's a breach of copyright. Google's policy doesn't seem to be to check any of these things out. They just take them down. Like it's just an automated process. But yeah, it's. I don't like to publicize it, Vince, but it's a very easy way to get anything taken down from the web that you don't like. And so we did a couple of stories about a company called Clickout Media, which are a sort of parasite SEO company. So there's a lot of companies that do this. They'll buy a website, like a news website, which has got high domain authority with Google, and just harvest that to that domain authority while it remains, to pump out kind of stories publicizing casinos, basically, or fairly dodgy casinos at that. And so we did a couple of stories about Clickout Media to sort of exposing them for what they were doing, buying loads of websites in the UK and kind of replacing human journalists with AI-generated ones who were writing stories about casinos. Yeah, and those stories were taken down because someone complained under the DMCA. We got these DMCA takedown notices, and so it's a mad system, isn't it? And it's a mad thing. To be fair, when we complain to Google about it, the stories do seem to reappear. So stories are only down for a few days, but I've heard that other people will have stories down for weeks, and it can cost you quite a lot of money to argue the toss to get these stories put back up. I think it's something that's being used increasingly, as far as we understand. Yeah, it's a ridiculous system.
Yeah, and sorry, I was kind of conflating the fake expert thing with the Clickout Media. I think in my head they're all kind of part of this same world of the black hat SEO stuff. And there's just this idea that I always make the joke of this is why we can't have nice things. So if something somebody comes up with some idea, some strategy, and then it just gets taken to the nth degree and completely exposes, the shortcomings of a lot of these platforms. And so, yeah, I have I started as more of an SEO. So I got into kind of the PR thing and where I'm at through kind of the digital PR of it all, which again is, it's a gamut of digital PR. There are people that say that they're doing digital PR, and I don't really think they are. They're doing kind of what you're saying, this coming up with a fake expert, and they're, once they find an in, then you just spin this thing out and works until somebody writes about it or decides to change the algorithm or whatnot. So it is a really interesting time, I think, for me too, kind of seeing living in this kind of realm of, with a foot in both the SEO world and the PR world of where things are headed. I'm curious, kind of to wrap all this up, of this, what is your take on the role of PRs, public relations professionals, in this, shrinking publishers, shrinking traffic? AI is pushing things to be done faster, quicker. There's this looming threat of like the agentic world taking over, and publisher sites not even really needing to be out there, right? Like the news is just going to be something that gets delivered right into an agent and then delivered to you, personalized, whatever. So I guess asking directly, do you think the PR industry is in trouble at all, or is this something that will always be a need?
Well, I think, just sort of bringing it all together. I mean, the whole problem is this idea of the facts being disaggregated from the journalism and just being fed into this kind of soup, and I guess, you worry that, the journalists and the PRs are threatened by that. But I think, everything I'm seeing and, my strong hunch and intuition remains that people actually want more human content now. They want more human stories. They are deeply suspicious about AI generated content, and they're very good at spotting it. If you look at children, very good at spotting it. They can spot it seconds. They don't like it. We continue, don't we? I've been a long time since I went to a newspaper or a website for the facts of the day. I go to it because I've got some writers that I enjoy. I like the point of view. I like the package. I like the photographs. I like the way the whole thing's presented. I like the experience. I don't mean that changes, but it certainly raises the bar for that. It has to be a lot better. I think the PRs, I think they need to lean into their humanity a bit as well. They need to pull back from that sort of spray and pray kind of form of PR that's become pretty popular because it's been possible, because you can have a database of thousands of journalists and you can, personalize an email and send it out thousands of times. I just don't think it works. I think it's like these news stories you get in the UK about people who say they've been out of work for 10 years and they've sent like 10,000 job applications. And I just feel like saying to them, the reason you haven't got a job is because you sent out 10,000 job applications. You should just send out one or two and really put some work into it, and you probably get a job interview, So I think it's the same with PRs. It's there. Yeah, they've got a really important role if they can do the work, if they can get to know the journalists, get to know the publications, find the stories, send a nice tailored pitch, win the trust of the reporters who are important in their markets, and just, don't pile it high, sell it cheap, just get a few good placements out there. And I don't know what you find, Vince, but I always think, it's the B2B brands that are probably the most important ones often, or the niche publications, the ones that have got the audience that are really care about the thing So I think the limited bit I know about PR is that people think, I want to be in the Financial Times, I want to be in the New York Times, whatever. But, you want to be in your niche, don't you? And there's the people who really care about that thing. And there's good opportunities, I think, for publishers and PRs, because there's a newsletter, isn't there, for every niche. And I think those things are actually quite well read. So, there's a lot more scope to get the word out there, I think. They remain important, the good PRs. Anyway, I think PR is definitely one of a bit like freelance journalism. In the Valley of the Blind, the one-eyed man is king. The few PRs that just really bother to work hard and get to know the journalists and think about tailored pitches do incredibly well.
Yeah, I love that answer. I mean, that follows all the research and data that we've been publishing here at BuzzStream. For anybody who's been following me knows I've been beating that drum too for that personalized approach, the smaller, more targeted media lists and all that stuff. So yeah, it's good to hear. I mean, I know it's tough for agencies too, to to think about it from that perspective, because I think in the past there has been such a focus on quantity over quality in terms of, oh, we got, 50 placements and whatever. But, these days I think less is more. Dominic, I don't want to keep you. I know you're a busy guy. We're coming up on time here. So I want to thank you so much for your time. This has been really illuminating. I want to let people know, Dominic, at Press Gazette, they have a great newsletter. I mean, obviously you should subscribe to Press Gazette itself, but the Daily Future of Media newsletter is fantastic. And Dominic, let me know, if you have questions about stuff that we've talked about today or the articles they're writing. I've done this a few times. Respond to the newsletter, reply to the newsletter, and typically Dominic will get back if he's got the time. I know, like I said, you're a busy guy.
I don't get that many replies to my newsletter, actually, so I always respond to them.
Yeah, fantastic to hear. A few quick reminders too, to again, subscribe, share this episode with your colleagues, that sort of thing. If you have questions for Dominic, like you said, reply to his newsletter, but you can also reply to the BuzzStream newsletter. Hit me up on Twitter, put questions in the comments on YouTube. That's where all this stuff will go. So definitely keep the lines of communication are open. I think it's important now more than ever to talk about this stuff and, share information. So thank you all for listening. Thank you so much, Dominic. This has been great.
Thanks, Vince.
Take care, everybody.